Hi, I'm
I would
Steve
do.
Hassan, and welcome to the Influence Continuum. I'm delighted to have a very dear old friend and colleague, over 30 years we've known each other, Jon Atack, who lives in Nottingham, England. And Jon and I met, I think, in 1989. And Jon was the foremost expert on Scientology, and I was the foremost expert on the Moonies. And we just like clicked, and we've become fast friends ever since. And Jon, um, it's a delight to have you on my podcast. And I want to just read, we'll cut this out. I want to introduce Jon Atack's new book, Opening Our Minds, which exposes the similarities between authoritarian cults, multi level marketers, pedophile groomers, terrorist radicalizers, pimps, and even spousal abusers. It highlights the manipulative tricks shared by political spin doctors, advertisers, and PR people. The book shows how to recognize human predators and prevent them from influencing our kids and ourselves. Jon has helped more than 600 people in their recovery. He's been a consultant or expert witness in at least 150 court actions and worked on over 200 media pieces. Jon has published more than 500 articles and papers and over 300 videos. He has a YouTube channel. His History of Scientology, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, is a bestseller that Scientology tried to suppress and failed. He has spoken at conferences all over the world and led the 5-day Getting Clear of Scientology seminar in Toronto. And I was very grateful to be a guest speaker with him. He's a scholar practitioner for 40 years. And Jon, as you know, I'm your biggest fan. Um, you are a treasure of knowledge and experience. But what I love also about you is you're a real human being. You're well-rounded. You're down to earth. You have humility. You're a musician. You're an artist. You're a painter. You're a poet. You're a translator, a novelist. I could go on and on and on. But I wanted you on my podcast because I really love this new book that you did. And I'm calling it the best new book about cults because it really breaks down very complicated ideas into easy to understand examples. And is it fair to say that you have decided that your focus is best spent in preventive education, wanting to develop curriculum and teach young people, but also everybody, how to protect themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. An ounce of prevention is worth about 7 tons of cure. That and understanding that the same dynamics apply. You know what it's like when you left the Moonies. You think I was in this group; those other groups are cults, and then you kind of
I
realize,
did.
oh, yeah,
I thought Scientology was a cult. How did you
yeah,
know?
yeah. Well, I was in Scientology, and I knew the Moonies was a cult.
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
and that so there's this kind of process of I tend to think that when you leave an authoritarian group, you're about 12 years old. You've been reduced down to that kind of just coming into puberty stage where you're controllable. And so then you have to go through adolescence when you leave. And part of that is realizing that the tricks and the traps are the same throughout society. And then, of course, getting that society functions in this way, that we live in a society that's like nested cultic shells.
Yeah.
So, and looking at the way our education system works, it's authoritarian, and it
Yep.
doesn't need to be. One of the big things for me is that we live in a time where many of the people I speak to, and in this counter cult field as well, they've given up. They don't really think there is any hope anymore because the situation in the world is pretty desperate. With
Yep.
global warming, with anti-vax movements, with all sorts of people like Bolsonaro and Duterte in power, and we could sit here and list probably 20 or 30 really dangerous authoritarian leaders.
Yeah.
And so people have often sort of said, well, we're doing the best we can and we might manage to help a few people. I don't have that point of view at all. I think we are at a point of transformation in the world where we can really make a difference right now. But it does mean that we're going to have to do something. Sitting back and going, someone should do something about that isn't actually going to work anymore. We've all got to be Greta Thunberg, or Greta Thunberg, if we prefer that pronunciation. We've all got to get out there and say, enough, blah, blah, blah. Let's do something.
Right. So, and so I share your visionary, aspirational desire to take our body of knowledge and experience. You're in your 60s, I'm in my 60s, and to transmit it in a way and have a platform where powerful influencers who are going, what do we do? And they're so paralyzed because things are interconnected, and money has corrupted so many people, not to mention bad actors doing psyops from outside but inside countries. And I'm not just talking about America, but the UK, Europe, etc. And so, and I think you share my belief that former members who have experienced the loss of their freedom, who've experienced their personality and their beliefs being, molded into some totalist, system, is oppressive and harmful for even people's health. So I want you to give, please, what are the highlights of Opening Your Minds, and why should people buy it or listen to the audiobook, and then share it as a gift?
I think the important thing is that you and I both, having each of us spent about 4 decades doing this, have come to realize that there are some very straightforward and simple ideas. And if we could get those through to children, if we could get them through to 13-year-olds, then they'd be much less likely to be drawn into the web of influence that's, the influence continuum, as you put it, that is, they'll be less likely to join authoritarian groups, to become authoritarian in their beliefs, which is to say they'll be less likely to be bullied. It's another way of saying it. And they'll be less likely to become bullies. They also won't get into relationships with people that are damaging. So the first, for me, the first point is to recognize, what are human predators? Who are these people? And rather than getting into are we going to diagnose this person as a psychopath, a sociopath, somebody with a Machiavellian personality disorder, a malignant narcissist, what have you, I don't really mind about that, or how it came about. That's all very interesting. I mind that we are affected by them on a daily basis. Many of our politicians are predators. Many of the people leading corporations, and it is not necessarily true. There are people high up in the business world who really care about the human race. And, I have the good fortune to have met such people, and they really do invest their fortunes. You have things like, say, the Reboot Foundation, where a very wealthy woman has decided she wants the world to understand critical thinking. It's very important. So, but there are people who are predatory, and we seem to get rather a lot of them in leading positions in the society. By teaching kids to recognize this, and it's very simple. I boiled it down to one page with which I start the book, so that before reading anything else, you can go, well, this is the page you need to read. And it shows you what these people are like. If you or I had read that before we fell in with Sun Myung Moon or Lafayette Ronald Hubbard, we would never have got involved, because the signs are so obvious for these people.
Right. So give our listeners a few examples, please, about human predators and how to recognize them, protect yourself.
Surely. The first thing to understand, and it seems simplistic to say it, is that such people are mean. And that if somebody's mean to you, you shouldn't just excuse it and justify it and say everybody has bad days. You should take notice. You'd say that person's just been mean. And if they're mean again,
If I
From
can,
there, they
if I can add, if you don't mind,
go ahead.
because mean predators often try to make it your fault
Mm,
that they acted that way. I'm sure you're
yeah,
going to get to that. But just in that frame, I thought it was important to add that they're mean, but they make you feel like you caused them to be
yeah,
rude or
yeah. Look what
condescending.
look what you've made me do. You know,
Right. Yeah. Please
it's
continue.
it'll be your fault if I kill the hostage. You know,
Right.
that they transfer responsibility and make it guilt
Right.
for you. Exactly right. The next thing is that they're completely selfish. That when you look at the way they behave, everything is about them. Everything is about what they get. They don't really care about other people, and they pretend friendship, they pretend love, but they don't actually feel anything for other people. Um, they tend to be charming. This and it's in it's good to know that there are actually empaths and good people who are charming as well,
Mm-hmm.
but they copy this, they mimic this by appearing to be very charming. They're good at flattery, which is to say insincere praise. In the Moonies, you had the phrase that's caught on around the world, love bombing,
Yeah.
where you, and it's so easy with, especially with young people, to say to them, "Oh, your hair looks great," and you're so clever, and the defenses go down. You
Oh,
become able
John,
to.
you don't realize how many gifts you have. You
It's
have
true.
leadership material.
I do.
People have not recognized your brilliance, John,
They haven't.
but our
They haven't.
program can
Yes,
help you.
it's true. What do I have? Where do I sign up? How much does this cost? Um, they don't mean what they say. Um, they tend to brag. They tend to boast a lot, and they make up lies. They exaggerate what they've done. So when you fact check them, you know, and can I mention Donald Trump at this point? No, we
Please.
don't want to get into that.
I wrote a
But
book on
so
him.
I mean, you've written a book about him, and he's just textbook. I've watched tens of hours of documentary about him, and he has a couple of phrases he uses. One of them is to the effect of, "I'm sure everybody's going to be really happy with what we've decided here about Guantanamo Bay or what have you."
Right.
But he he has these coverall phrases that
Yeah, and I
and
want
he
to
then
just thank you because you helped me with chapter 3 because I compared Trump with Hubbard, Moon,
mm,
and Jim Jones. I
yeah,
couldn't miss the opportunity to, because there's so much attention and knowledge about Scientology through Leah Remini and Mike
mm,
Rinder and so many other top people who have left, written books, and done all kinds of interviews
mm.
over the decades. Please
There,
continue.
there's been some amazing work.
Yeah.
When they're challenged on anything, they blame somebody else. It's never their fault. They're never responsible. And there are two kinds of predator. There are those that don't actually feel any anxiety or fear, and those tend to be the kind of psychopath types. But then there are the ones that actually are scaredy cats, and they never involve themselves in anything dangerous. However, they'll get you to do dangerous things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Rajneesh, one of the stories that Hugh Milne tells in The God That Failed, which is an excellent book. He was Rajneesh's bodyguard,
Yeah.
and he actually went to India to find out things about Rajneesh's childhood. This is the man who called himself Bhagwan, or the Supreme God,
Right.
and is now known as Osho the Buddha by his few
Right.
remaining
And for
followers.
our listeners who watch Netflix and saw Wild Wild Country, this is the cult leader you're referring to.
This is the small man with the beard who took a huge amount of drugs every day,
Yep.
and pretended that he wasn't speaking to people. And but he, as a child, actually dared another child to walk on a tightrope, and the child fell off and died. And this is, get other people to take risks. So if you feel somebody's pushing you to take risks, walk away, get out of the way. They're very impulsive. They're easily bored. So they want thrills. They want something to stimulate them and excite them. And which means that they will sometimes themselves take dangerous risks, or sometimes make you take them. Ron Hubbard liked to throw people off his ship. when he was in Corfu Harbour, and they'd be thrown from a height beyond the high diving board, the swimming pool. They'd have their ankles tied together and they'd be blindfolded, and he'd throw them into the water, which was his way of having fun. They tend to be bullies, and they tend to have explosive tempers. This is a real giveaway. That so if you go on a date with somebody and they're all sweet and nice to you, and then the waiter, there's a smudge on the glass and they'll scream at the waiter, and then they're nice and sweet to you again. Watch out. The explosive temper is not a good thing. They're cunning, they're manipulative. They enjoy humiliating people. They like putting people down, making them squirm, and they weaken the people around them with insults. So this is a way of gaining power. They'll gaslight people, they'll triangulate, where they'll tell one person nasty things about another person. They don't like it if anybody else has any kind of power, or is praised in any way. They'll react to that. So for them,
because they think they're the center of the universe, so they want all the praise coming to them, right?
Absolutely, and particularly with the narcissistic types, without that adulation, they crumple. When Trump came to believe that 1 million people were going to go and see him talk, and it was actually K-pop fans who'd booked fake tickets, there was video of him as he arrived back at the White House from Air Force One, and it's the only time I've ever seen it on camera. He is usually looks ebullient. He'd undone his tie and he was walking along sulking. What's called a collapsed narcissist.
Yeah.
For them, life is a competition. Ron Hubbard said life's a game. It isn't, and it really isn't. It's serious, and it's not about winning or losing. But for them, it's all about winning and being right. They lie easily. They think nothing of breaking promises. They don't have a conscience. They don't feel remorse or guilt. And they boast about how much they've hurt people. I mean, I remember we went to, you were giving a workshop in London, in Hendon. We did a press conference together in 2014. And there was this guy there, and he was boasting, and he was saying that he'd gone for a job interview and he'd been treated really badly. And then 2 years later, the guy who was interviewing him turned up trying to get a job at his firm, and he deliberately strung him along so that he could drop him and humiliate him. And you go, yep, that's a predator. That's the way it works. They're parasites. They do as little as possible. They live off others. They won't volunteer to help. They won't do anything. They're control freaks. They micro control everything around them, and they stop others from taking control. They force petty rules onto people. They will, and this can happen with anybody. I remember there's a wonderful documentary called Time Is All You've Got about the clarinet player Artie Shaw, who was a brilliant man, I think. But one of his seven ex-wives said that if you didn't fold the toilet tissue the right way, you were told off. And I'm not suggesting he was a predator. I don't think he was. I think he probably just had a little bit of Asperger's going on or something.
Yeah. Liked
his toilet tissue folding properly. But it's a characteristic to make rules that you can't actually keep. And finally, they boast about tricking other people, and they boast about breaking the law. So we actually have a poster on my website that you can download and put on your refrigerator.
What is the URL of your website?
We'll put it in the links. I think it's probably opening our minds, but I couldn't be sure at the moment.
Okay.
But that's a summary of those points.
So,
and the book expands upon that.
Yeah, it's brilliant and it's wonderful. And if you were listening and you go, that describes my ex-husband, or that describes my boss, what is your advice to people if they're starting to, this is a portrait of someone that I know who I have an involvement with. Now what?
Reduce your involvement.
Run away would be what I would say. Get away. Yeah. Create an exit strategy. Find support.
Yeah. Get away from the person and whatever control they have over your life. Now, it does happen that there are different kinds of predators. So at the one end of the scale, you have the criminal psychopath. There doesn't seem to be anything we can do about criminal psychopaths other than lock them up and stop
Yep.
them from hurting other people. That's sad. Hopefully
Yep.
we will find out some way of dealing with them. It also appears that they are born that way, that they have a deficit in the paralimbic system. The connection between the impulsive old brain and the thinking brain is weakened, and they're born that way. And
Yep.
so, I mean, one of the Kent Keel, who did more than 500 fMRI scans on imprisoned psychopaths,
Right.
he had one guy who said to him, if he'd looked at you the way he looked at me, you'd have killed him. And it's that, what? Looked at me that way, I'd have killed him. That's the way they think.
Mhm.
But at the other end, you have narcissists who, there might be some hope for people with a narcissistic personality disorder. So you have to make a decision about whether somebody is a predator because that's just the way it is, or if there is something you can do to help them. But if you do want to try and help them, find an ally outside of the relationship. Find somebody who knows about this and
Yep.
can help you. Don't think you can take this on without understanding.
Yeah, knowledge is power. That's, and may I ask how long you were involved with Scientology?
For 9 years.
Uh-huh. And you went up to OT5, one of the upper level of
at that time there were 27 levels in Hubbard's Bridge to Total Freedom, and I did 25 of them. There's been one added since. But my situation was really unusual because I was never embedded. I was never immersed. I was a true believer. I believed in it all, but I lived on the outside. I was never.
You were a
member.
public Scientologist.
I was what's called a public Scientologist.
So you didn't sign on for the billionaire contract like Sea Org members?
Luckily, no.
Yeah.
I mean, originally that contract was a joke. It was put to Hubbard as a joke, and he went, "Yes." You sign up for 1,000 million years. I mean, luckily, it's not the UK billion, which is a million, which would be much worse. But,
But I want to just comment. I asked you how long you were involved and how high up you got, because I want to state, as you've heard me say before, you're one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, one of the most well-read, one of the best memories, and just able to integrate information. But you bought into the lie. There was hypnosis and a whole social, systematic social influence process. But you did realize at a certain point, I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah, and for me, it was strange because I think I was able to stand up and speak out because I wasn't humiliated and abused. There's a rule in Scientology that you have to handle celebrities with kid gloves. And Scientology has its own, luckily for me, its own definition of celebrity. If you are a writer, an artist, a musician, and I'm all three, then you are a celebrity. The fact that I was only barely scraping a living didn't matter. So I was treated in a different way. And I walked away and I didn't feel, that I'd been abused in any way. But tens and hundreds of people were coming to me. I actually left because I thought Hubbard was dead and we needed to save this wonderful Scientology. And so I was at the center of the independent movement in the United Kingdom.
Right.
And about 2 or 3 months in, I was delivered this bundle of documents gathered by a guy called Michael Lynn Shannon about Hubbard's life. And it's about 18 inches stack, and I just sat and read through it. And there was no, it was impossible to contradict. Hubbard was a liar. And for me, he said honesty is sanity. The road to truth, which he said Scientology was, must be trod with true steps. And I went, well, if the man laying down the track is a liar, then the track is not trustworthy. What shocked me was that almost nobody I spoke to saw that. They said, oh, well, no, the reason he contradicts himself, and says he was a war hero here and says he wasn't a war hero here, the reason he claims to be a nuclear physicist, where here he says he was thrown out of university and failed a course in atomic, which he did. There's a lecture in the 23rd of September 1950, called Introduction to Dianetics, where Hubbard, in his own voice, says he was thrown out of university for failing this course. Later, he will claim to be a nuclear physicist. He claimed he'd studied with gurus in the East. This is all nonsense. It's all made up. He was a pulp fiction writer who just kept making bigger and bigger stories about himself. Having realized that, I said, I have to stop doing all of this. I have to reject all of it. And then I'll look at the principles one by one and take them back piecemeal if I accept them. I've not found anything in Scientology that isn't better expressed by the people that the idea was stolen from. It's all plagiarized. I wrote a paper called Possible Origins of Dianetics and Scientology many years ago, showing, I think, 120 Hubbard ideas, where he not only uses somebody else's idea, he actually names that person. So he was aware of where he'd stolen these ideas from.
Yeah, like
but none of it is useful.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, like
Korzybski.
Korzybski.
Language.
The notion of words, that Korzybski says the word is not the thing itself. He says the map is not the territory. Most of his ideas, though, came directly from Aleister Crowley, the famous sex magician. Crowley, in fact, wrote to one of his subordinates who was performing sex magic ceremonies with Hubbard. They were masturbating together, these two men. He wrote to this subordinate and said, Hubbard's a con man. And the subordinate, Jack Parsons, the inventor of solid rocket fuel at Jet Propulsion Laboratories, actually gave all of his money, $35,000 in 1946, to Hubbard to set up a business buying and selling yachts, and then sued Hubbard to try and get his money back, having realized that Aleister Crowley was actually correct. So,
yeah, and we're going to move on from Scientology in a minute, but my understanding is you are the archivist in your mind of everything, every major book that's been written, whether it's Lawrence Wright or Janet Reitman. They all took your material that you had researched and written about. Am I overstating it, or is that pretty accurate?
Stephen Kent, the head of the history of religion and sociology at Alberta University, said that my work is the foundation for all modern scholarship on Scientology. Yeah. And, there were 14 books written before mine. The first one in my book was published in 1990 first. It's been re-released in the unexpurgated version. Right. So the title's been changed to Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky rather than just a piece of blue sky. But the first book was written in 1951 by a doctor who'd worked for 3 months with Hubbard on the formulation of Dianetics. It's called A Doctor's Report on Dianetics. And from there was a lot of work done. There's an incredible journalist called James Phelan, who in the early 1960s studied Hubbard and found things out. And in the late 60s, another called Alexander Mitchell. So I found those things, but people are starting to realize the internet wasn't there when I researched.
Right.
It meant I had to go around and interview people and collect documents. So if you look to Janet Reitman's Inside Scientology, which was a bestseller, the first 7 chapters, when you look to the reference notes, she says largely based upon Piece of Blue Sky or Russell Miller's Barefaced Messiah. Barefaced Messiah is based upon Piece of Blue Sky, and I was the researcher throughout the Barefaced Messiah project. Excellent book, and what a brilliant title, Barefaced Messiah. So, yeah, and in the mid-90s, I worked with Chris Owen, who is a historian, who's done excellent work on Scientology. He's never been involved with Scientology. And he and I decided what documents should be publicly available. And thousands of pages of documents were put on the internet. When I came to republish Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, there was a somewhat eccentric man, the late Arnie Lerma. And I asked him to write a puff piece for the book, and he wrote, before the internet and safety in numbers, there was Jon Atack. And that's probably...
Yeah, and they harassed you, they fair gamed you. And
16 years, solid.
Horrible. Yeah. And Mike Rinder, who is head of OSA, was on the dishing out of the abuse that was heaped on you as the whistleblower that you are. But
yeah,
you know
and we're now great friends.
Yeah,
So
it's it just shows that people, and I think he was in 46 years, can leave. You know, once the bubble pops and you realize I'm trusting a liar, I'm
mm,
trusting a predator.
mm.
Why I'm valuable. Like I have a life. I don't need to be someone else's slave. I don't need to be
Mike,
labor trafficked.
yeah, Mike Rinder was 6 years old when his parents got involved in Australia. He was 18 when, as you say, he was trafficked. He was sent to Europe, got onto Hubbard's ship. His passport was taken away.
Right.
He'd gone there to train and go back to Australia, and he's told, "No, you now work for us." And
Yeah.
he ended up working directly for Hubbard, and has many. There's some things on my YouTube channel, some interviews I've done with him, and even I was incredulous. I mean, I've talked to hundreds of people about Scientology,
Right.
but every now and then some new story will come up. It was on the other week. I was talking to Karen de la Carriere, and she had interviewed who was a
Tell people who
was
she is because she's
Karen de la
very
Carriere
famous.
is one of only 8 people who reached the very highest level in Scientology, which is called
Mm-hmm.
a class 12 case supervisor, which is very meaningless. But only 8 people reached this level. She interviewed a woman who had come out much more recently than she did. I mean, Karen was also married to the president of the Church of Scientology, Hebrew Yench, along the way. Wonderful, wonderful woman. She'd interviewed this woman who said that now their secret international base, which is not very secret, it's at Gilman Hot Springs in California. David Miscavige, the dictator of Scientology, who's now actually been in charge of Scientology for longer than Hubbard was, been there since 1986, that Miscavige has them go through the confessional reports every week, and whoever has done the most extreme form of masturbation gets to go on the stage and have their report read out to the whole group. And
To shame them.
my jaw just dropped. And the thing is, you've got 300 or 400 people standing in the room, and nobody is saying, nobody, and you or me, we would have stood up and said, no, you don't do
Yeah.
this.
Right.
But nobody dares. They've all been cloned into this position.
Programmed with fears. So,
Yeah.
Jon, we can talk for hours, but I'd like to just kind of hit on some key topics that you and I have talked about. You've done YouTubes on, just to show the breadth of your knowledge, but also to get people curious and interested in learning more. So you introduced me to Yuval Laor's and his theory about awe and fervor. Can I ask you to share why you, and I am now a convert, believing this is really a missing, very critical piece to understanding my bite model, for example, of mind control with the E of emotional control. Say some words about Yuval and his theory, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, I introduced him to you about 10 minutes after I met him because he was up at Toronto.
Right.
He and I talk almost every week. And,
like us.
Yeah, as do we. And we visited with each other as we have. I've been to conferences with him in Bordeaux, in Riga, in Manchester. We went with my 2 youngest boys on a holiday to Spain. He comes and stays here when he's going out to Israel. So we spend a lot of time together. And he brought the work of Eva Jablonka, who's a professor at Tel Aviv University and one of the leading experts on evolution. And what she's saying, and I think it is generally accepted now, that the idea of, there's just natural selection and sexual selection where, the partners you choose will determine how people look, that beyond that, there's also epigenetics, which are behaviors which can influence genes. Genes are not read-only. You can write on them, contrary to what Richard Dawkins says. But there's also the fascinating idea of symbolic evolution, cultural transmission. And cultural transmission is, you can see it in animals. So, for example, if you look at lions in different parts of Africa, in some prides of lions, the females do all hunting. In others, the males hunt. And that's a cultural transmission that's passed on from generation to generation that actually affects our genes. With human beings, we have language, and language becomes, because we then have writing, we have a memory. And so our evolution, for me, this was exciting because it was almost a kind of spiritual thing to realize that it is actually important what every person does, that we're all part of this changing web of humanity, and we can all influence the future for humanity. And at the moment, the kind of selfish short-termism, which our politicians are like, how do I get voted back in, being the main idea, because then I'll do good things, that stupid idea that we must look to the future and our behavior, and that includes our feelings, you know, the way we behave. So it had always seemed to me that you've covered the ground very well with the bite model, but it seemed that emotional part was not fully refined. I talked to, and you talked about people getting a peak experience in a group, getting high, getting euphoric, and therefore entering into states where their critical thinking is impaired. And it doesn't matter how clever you are. You know, I'd read Plato long before I arrived at Scientology at the age of 19. I'd read the Crito, the Phaedo, the Symposium, the Last Dialogue of Socrates. I knew about Socratic reasoning, and I then used it to believe in Scientology. So not to evaluate Scientology. And the important thing is the emotional connection we make, where we develop what William James called feelings of knowing, that these certainties about this is the right person, you know, this person is a hero, this person is wonderful. And belief transforms. I had an example of it, which I always use. I was about 17 and a street evangelist came up to me, and we talked for 2 hours because, you know what I'm like, Steve, I'm very gregarious. And the end of 2 hours, he literally backed away from me. It was like I was going to jump on his back, and I wasn't being unpleasant. I was just saying, have you thought about it this way or what? Because I just happened to have reread the Gospels, and I'm fascinated by the teaching of Jesus, but I didn't really believe in the God that the Christian church was trying to persuade me to believe in. And as he backed away, he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Those are the feelings of knowing. And Yuval has shown that because we will accept something that is inexplicable that occurs, something that seems miraculous. And, you know, we both talk about the work of Derren Brown, who has shown again and again how easy it is.
The stage entertainer who does, you know, NLP manipulation, hypnotic suggestion, etc. Go on.
And I mean, interesting, he's never studied NLP. He's just understood, and as you know, you said, Erickson and Bateson are behind anything that's come out through NLP. But he's understood how you can distract somebody and make them think that something's impossible. So he did a show where he did Russian roulette, spinning a bullet in a chamber, and didn't blow his head off, you know, because he actually was in complete control. He got people, business people, to hold up a security wagon with a gun, which in this country was even more unusual. Well, a lot more unusual in the US.
Right.
He showed how you can get people to believe something. There's even there's a wonderful show called Messiah, where he talks with a room full of atheists. They've only come there because they're atheists. And he gets them all believing in God without really saying anything, because he's able to subtly move that belief. So Yuval talks about awe and the way that you develop awe in a person, that sense of transcendence, and how that can then be transmuted into fervor. And you can apply his model, and he has low and high fervor people. He shows, you know, that
we're gonna move on from Yuval, because his theory, I think we've interviewed him for 3 hours at a time, and it's so rich. But the critical thing is,
his materials on my channel.
It's a natural thing to look up to celebrities that you admire and kind of like imbue an emotional state and status. You know, oh, I'm going to be near Paul McCartney or whatever. I just watched the Beatles documentary. But the that's how I felt towards Moon. Like people were like, oh, he's greater than Jesus. He's the most amazing, and the guy farted and smelled bad and didn't clean his ears. Like, I was a leader and I got to experience those things. That didn't break through my awe of him because
Yeah,
I was
I mean,
so.
Hubbard had rotting teeth and smelled awful. He had a great
Yes,
big lump, a cyst on his head, but people still come away going, "Oh, but he was so wonderful." You know, he was charismatic.
right. But understanding how emotional states influence us profoundly, we may
Hmm.
rationalize later and justify through the experience of why we're joining a destructive cult or whatever. But it hacks our system, our personalities, our minds, or
Yeah, we
can.
use the full weight of our intelligence to buttress our stupidity. When you look at the founders of science, look at, say, Isaac Newton, who's considered by many to be perhaps the most significant of all scientists. He
Right,
actually spent more time performing alchemy than physics, and his physics was all done as a young man. He
right.
spent more time trying to find the code in the Bible that would show him the dimensions of Solomon's temple, which would be the proportions of the universe. And you go, that's science? I mean, that's not my idea. And you can go through one person after another where we have this belief that they're really rational and calm and calculating, and find they aren't. Galileo, he had two children, two daughters. He put them both into a convent. Yet he's meant to be the man that was against religion. And his argument with the Pope had nothing to do with whether the sun, whether the earth goes around the sun. It was because he'd made a fool of the Pope, calling him buffo or fool in a book he'd written.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of fantasy that there is calm reason on one side and emotion on the other, we don't actually, as human beings, separate those things. And once we have feelings of knowing, once we think that something's true, we will use our intelligence to believe that thing. So critical thinking, which we should all develop, we also need critical emoting. We need to be
Yes.
aware of our emotions.
Yes, self-awareness is so absolutely important. And to realize we're all human and to disconnect our egos from our beliefs and be prepared to change our beliefs if evidence is produced that's substantial, even though we have an investment maybe for 9 years or however many years in a particular ideology or group, to go, oops, you know, I did the best I could at the time, what I believed was real or true or the experiences, but now I know better. And once your eyes open and you go, because I had a similar thing in my waking up, realizing that Moon was a liar. And if he was a
Yeah.
liar, how could he be an agent of God? Or how could he be trustworthy? It's not possible. So, like, for me, that was where I was like, wait a minute, I've been putting him on a pedestal, thinking he's the greatest man on earth who knows everything, and he's going to lead us to this paradise on earth. And once I allowed that negative thought in my consciousness, it was like a house of cards just going plop, 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 plop in my mind.
Yeah.
It was all based on the presupposition. He knew something great, and he didn't. I want to switch topics, if I may, in the time that we have remaining, because we've talked extensively about meditation and,
Yep.
in particular, the rage of mindfulness meditation. And I thought I would ask you to share some thoughts that you have about that with our listeners.
And I think it really exemplifies the way that emotion overcomes reason. I've over the years I've subscribed to New Scientist for 30 years, and I've had, I think, 8 letters published. But I've written to them 3 times about mindfulness and been ignored because they've written these kind of eulogies about mindfulness. So, for example, the comedian Ruby Wax, who is known to suffer from bipolar disorder, bless her, incredibly funny, clever woman. She went and did a master's degree in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy at Oxford University with a man called Mark Williams, and raved about how fantastic mindfulness is. So I wrote and pointed out that a number of mindfulness practitioners, for example, Professor Willoughby Britton at Brown University, have said, hang on a minute. Oxford University, in fact, the guy who's writing the Miguel Farias, who's writing the Oxford Handbook of Meditation, he says, I'm a mindfulness meditator, but a friend of mine said, you're becoming a junkie. And he said he was right. I was spending too much time doing it. So I pointed to scientific information, including the $110 million that have failed to produce results spent by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. They only spent 23 million on transcendental meditation. And the bizarre claims are being made. The idea that by meditating, which is fundamentally mindfulness, is what's called the Zazen meditation, that by meditating, you can overcome anxiety, depression. It's actually recommended in our health service here. And doctors who fail to point a depressed patient towards the possibility of mindfulness, or a patient who's in pain, can actually risk discipline. Yet there is no substantial evidence to support this. So people say, oh, but I felt better when I did it. Well, that's okay. The side example, which I studied, is I actually did the Zazen meditation. I learned it in a Zen monastery when I was 18. So I'm very much aware of what it is. I've practiced it for years.
Was that in Japan, John?
No, it was in the north of England, but it was under Jiu Kennet, who, of course, received the third transmission to the masterhood in a Japanese monastery.
Right.
And she is a controversial figure. You know, the former president of her association at Mount Shasta. Is it Josh Barron?
Josh Barron is a friend of ours who was in that cult. Yeah.
And he was high up, and he points out that it's an authoritarian group, but nonetheless, it is traditional Soto Zen Buddhism. Right. There's a wonderful book by a man called Brian Victoria called Zen at War. And he is a Zen priest who has researched the period from the 1890s onwards, where Zen meditation was taught to all of the military, and the ruthlessness, the brutality of the Japanese military during World War II. I think if you're a prisoner of war with the Japanese, you had a 40% likelihood of dying, whereas if you were a prisoner with the British, you had a 0.2% danger of dying while in captivity. We know, the bridge on the River Kwai, they ate the inhabitants of islands, called them black pigs. The terrible atrocities that were committed. He details them, and it was only after the publication of his book in the 1990s that two of the Rinzai sects of Zen actually publicly apologized. The Soto Zen sect had already apologized because they were training people. You then shift over to mindfulness, and Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's the man who's made millions from it, has said that you don't need the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, right thought, right action, right belief. You don't need these things. All you need to do is meditate mindfully, and you will achieve compassion. He then went off to train the American military in mindfulness meditation. You go, hang on a minute, didn't I just say that the Japanese military were all trained in this? And it certainly didn't make them compassionate. But the scientific community want to believe this.
Right.
So they won't. Everything I wrote was evidence-based, with numbers, where the studies were. They wouldn't publish it at New Scientist. So that bias is a feelings of knowing. It's, don't rock the boat, don't upset us. We need devil's advocates, as Irving Yanis said in talking about groupthink. Every group needs somebody in there who says, I don't think that's a good idea. I am that person.
Yeah, it's great. And we have a mutual friend. Actually, you introduced him to me, his work to me. I haven't met him yet, Ira Chaloff.
Yeah.
And he wrote a great book, Intelligent Disobedience and Courageous Followership. I want to share a few things about his work.
Yeah,
please.
Ira's a dear friend. He was involved in Scientology. We first met in 1977. We became friends, close friends, a couple of years afterwards. Excuse me. And Ira went in about 1982. He worked for me. I had a little artist agency. He worked for me part-time. And he went to work in Washington on Capitol Hill. I think with the idea of bringing Scientology's brilliant administrative technology to politics.
Right.
And he found that the administrative technology was rubbish. the guy he was working for knew so much more about people and how to get them to work together. Before Al Gore was president, Ira worked, I think, for 8 months sorting his office out and making it work better. And he developed this idea of courageous followership, which I think comes from having worked closely with Ron Hubbard and seeing what a bullying tyrant he was, and saying there's a responsibility for followers to do something about this. And so he developed a whole subject, which is now all over the world. He's recognized, he's a traveling fellow of Cambridge University. He's been he's spoken at the European Council, he's spoken at Sandhurst Military College, he's spoken to the FBI, to all sorts of people. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. And he was giving a talk one day, and a woman said, I have an example of what you're talking about under my desk. And he said, oh, I'm sorry. And she brought out a guide dog that she was training. And she said, this dog has to be able to, if a blind person is being guided by the dog has to be able to say, no, stop. You're about to walk into something. And we call this intelligent disobedience. Why don't we teach this to our children? So if you look up blink, think, choice, voice, those 4 words in Google, you get a little 5-minute video about how to teach 4-year-olds.
It's great. I've shared it a million times.
Yeah.
To give young people, but it's really for adults too. If you're in a situation that's incongruent, some authority figure is asking you to do something that you're not sure about, blink, like take a pause or take a deep breath and think about it and realize you have a choice. You don't have to comply. And if you're a little person, tell. So-and-so is trying to tell me to hurt my opponent on the football field, or so-and-so is wanting me, to abuse me sexually or something. You got to empower people to stand up to authority that is not legitimate.
Yeah, and there is a problem. Authoritarianism is a system of compliance and obedience. And we are teaching the wrong thing in our schools. It should be, when you're born, you can't look after yourself. But by the time you're 18, you should be able to look after yourself. And so schools should be giving ever more responsibility. And they actually tend to take it away. And it's not the fault of teachers. They're trapped in the system that is forcing them to do this. The work of Matthew Lipman is very important. Also Ken Robinson, who's
he had one of the most popular TED Talks, Ken Robinson, I think, about how the education system is set up like a factory assembly line, and we batch children by their ages, and it's like the opposite of encouraging creativity, spontaneity, play, curiosity, all the good things.
It's appalling. And you see, this is why I'm so hopeful for the future, because my current work is to develop curricula for schools, so that kids will recognize human predators, so that they'll understand the techniques of seduction and recruitment that are used, and so they'll be able to tell facts from fiction, see if something is fake news or not.
Right.
And these are not actually that complicated. The fake news one, for example, are only 7 points that you need to have to understand this. And if all kids are shown this, and we can just make that slight move so that a small percentage of kids go, hang on a minute, I don't think we should be doing that. I think we saw it, if you look at August 1914, when people in this country were queuing to go and kill Germans, that it was the thing people most wanted to do. When the Iraq War, the second Iraq War happened, 80% of the population said, not in my name. We don't want to do this. 1 million people marched to London and said no. That's an incredible public transformation. And
good point.
with just a little bit more of a push, and society has transformed so much morally. In the 1870s, in the US and in Europe, children of 4 years old would put up chimneys to clean them. And if they got stuck in the chimney, they were left there to die. They were put down the mines. Thankfully, our justice system has got better. It needs to get a lot better still, because there's still a lot of corruption. There's still a lot of authoritarianism in our system. But the good cops and the good judges and the good people in the fire service and the first
Good with
responders.
conscience, looking for real justice as opposed to political expediency.
And the good teachers, perhaps the most important people in a society are good teachers, and they've had power taken away from them so that they can do SATs. And you look at the achievements tables, the PISA tables that are taken every 2 years all around the world, and 170 countries do them. And the countries that come at the top in literacy, the Scandinavian countries, they have one examination. In their whole time they're at school, they sit one examination. It's not all of this. You have to learn all of these bits of information and be able to spew them out. No, you have to be able to understand the topic so you can do something with it.
Yeah, and even more importantly, teaching a love of learning and teaching people
curiosity.
how to research. That's, all kids seem to have that natural curiosity and playfulness. And on my influence continuum, I talk about the authoritarian side where there's corporal punishment and children are being hit and spanked and beaten and belted and paddled. And that does brain damage, according to the experts studying that.
Of course it does.
But they're training people to be blind, obedient to authority figures.
Yeah, and that is authoritarianism, the idea that the bullies who think they should be in charge and the people who think bullies should be in charge. That gave us Nazism, and it gives us the neo-Nazi movements and the Ku Klux Klan, all sorts of these deranged movements. And for me, it's not a matter of looking at the left or the right. When I see this idea, the left can go authoritarian, the right is authoritarian. I believe in democracy. I believe in the center. And that means people being willing to take responsibility. And we can't have proper democracies until people are willing to say, yeah, this is what I want. This is what should be done.
Right.
Virtual Taiwan has given us an example of that, which was to say, well, if they had a division over the electric scooters and they put it to the people to talk about it, created and actually came to a solution that if you wore a crash helmet and you drove at a certain speed and these laws, and they looked for a supermajority, 2/3 of the people agreeing before saying, we'll make this law. And it was a way of showing that you can democratically make laws rather than these incredible arbitrary ways that which belong in the 19th century, most of them, things like the electoral college system in the US. I mean, what a ridiculously undemocratic system, that a political party can control a state.
Right.
It made sense in 1773, maybe, but it doesn't make much sense anymore.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're struck in our moment in America with the potential undoing of counting everybody's vote fairly and squarely, and going with who wins. And this coup that's been brewing for really decades is in full form right now. And I'm in for the duration to do what I can to shed a light, share an experience, try to explain the concepts. And I'm delighted to know that, you are there, you're on the other side of the ocean, but that we have, really talented, intelligent, experienced people who are prepared to teach, but we have been largely stigmatized, minimized, ignored. Your example with the Scientist magazine is another just an example of your comments don't fit in the cubbyhole that we think is what people want to read about, or what the common notion is. As you were describing that, I was thinking about in the US, if anyone has an alcohol, arrest, they're mandated in many states to go to AA or go to 12-step programs, despite all of the horrible cure rates of 12-step programs. I think it's somewhere 5 to 8% of everybody that goes through that. But they're made to feel like they're going to be an alcoholic for their whole life, that they're powerless, and other deleterious beliefs. So as we bring our interview, our connection, I don't feel like this was an interview, it was more like a chat, to an end, I want to invite you, kind of, give you the last words for our audience.
I think there's one important idea that I kind of stumbled into while I was researching this book. And the book is a distillation of 40 years of trying to understand these problems and try and, looking into the social psychology and the history and saying, well, how can this be explained in straightforward terms? And one of the essential misconceptions that exists in religion and in psychology is the idea that you have an enemy inside yourself. Freud talked about the id, this beast that dwells within. Some religions will talk about gedons, dibbuks, demons that live inside you. In Scientology, body thetans. The idea of an unconscious mind, as Freud put it forward, which is completely inaccurate. But it's like there's this hidden enemy fighting you on the inside. And people manipulate us by saying, you don't know what's going on in there. Well, I think we do. And I think we can be conscious of all of the unconscious processes that are going on inside ourselves that we need to be. I mean, we don't need to be controlling our heart rate and things like that. And so, that we are already, I mean, one of the statements that's made in Buddhism is, I am enlightened, you're enlightened. So we're already enlightened. I personally don't really believe in enlightenment. I believe in relationship with other human beings. Yeah, I think that's the vital thing. But so taking that and taking hope from it, that we can actually transform the world and make it a better place. That means getting together. And it means if you've had dreadful experiences, rather than spending your life whinging about the group and attacking the group that did these awful things to you, it's time to come out of adolescence and become adult and do something in the world about authoritarianism itself. And you're bringing more power to the masses, to the people, to do good in the world. So there's my author's message for the day.
It's fantastic. Jon, you're wonderful. I can't wait to come visit you. Next year, we have a plan to be together to celebrate a wonderful occasion.
We do.
And we need to kind of mobilize and organize and in a strategic way, because we're the underfunded or no funded,
non-funded
whistleblowers who are like,
and the cults of
we've been there.
People. And we can help. I know how to de-radicalize people if any government's actually interested in doing that, which they don't seem to be. I've been trying for 25 years to talk to governments about that, and it would be good to actually get something moving. So anybody out there who has organizational skills and who feels has some money that they would like to put to a good cause, that would be very useful.
I heartily second your notion. So thank you, my friend. Be well, stay safe.
Yes,
and thank
Great
you again
pleasure.
so much.
As always. Thank you, Steve. Bye-bye.
Bye.